The mist hung heavy over the Uji River, thick enough to blur the line between water and sky. The world seemed to hold its breath. From the eastern hills, a faint orange light began to bloom, the first hint of dawn, and in that light, the shapes of men appeared, standing silent on the riverbank. They were soldiers, some young, some old, their armor darkened by moisture. They waited, motionless, their breath forming pale clouds in the morning air. Among them stood a single figure, calm and still, his hands resting lightly on a long, curved bow. His beard was white, his face lined with age, but his eyes were clear. He watched the river as though he could see beyond it, beyond the mist, beyond the present, into history itself. This was Minamoto no Yorimasa. At 74, he had lived long enough to see beauty turn to violence, loyalty turn to ambition, and peace turn to war. And now, in the year 1180, he stood on the edge of an age, the last of the old world and the first of the new. The Uji River flowed quietly at his feet, carrying the reflection of a building that seemed to hover above it. The Phoenix Hall of Byodo Inn, one of Japan's most exquisite temples, spread its graceful wings across the water. It was a place meant to evoke paradise. But on this day, paradise had become a fortress. Yorimasa turned his head slightly. Behind him, men were fastening armor, whispering prayers, and checking the strings of their bows. Among them were samurai of his clan, proud, loyal warriors, and monks from the nearby temples of Midera and Mount Hiei. These were Sohei, warrior monks, their faith hardened by years of conflict. They carried naginata, long, curved blades mounted on poles, and their chants blended with the soft murmur of the river. They were few in number, perhaps a few hundred at most, but each man knew why he was here. Across the mist, faint sounds echoed, the beat of drums, the snort of horses, the rhythmic clatter of armor. The Taira were coming. Yorimasa looked once more toward the far bank. He knew what awaited them there, the army of Taira no Kiyomori, the most powerful man in Japan. The Taira clan had ruled the empire for decades, wielding influence at court and on the battlefield alike. Kiyomori's daughter had married into the imperial family. His grandson was now emperor. The Taira's crimson banners had become a symbol of control and oppression. To the old noble families, they were usurpers. To the warrior clans of the provinces, they were tyrants. To the Minamoto, they were an old wound that still bled. And now, under Yorimasa's leadership, the Minamoto had chosen to challenge them once more. He had not taken up arms for ambition. He had done so because of a promise, a call to loyalty that had stirred something in his soul. A young prince named Mochihito had sent out a proclamation across the land, accusing the Taira of corruption and urging the Minamoto to restore justice to the realm. Most who received it hesitated. The Taira were too strong, their grip on the court too absolute. But Yorimasa had answered. It was not the first time he had stood against overwhelming odds. But this time, he knew, it would be his last. As the light grew stronger, the details of the world came into focus. The damp wooden bridge stretching across the river, the reeds trembling in the breeze, the faint outline of archers taking position along the bank. Somewhere behind him, a monk began chanting softly, invoking Amida Buddha to guide the souls of those who would die today. Yorimasa listened, then closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he thought of Heian, the capital he had served for so many years. He imagined its wide avenues lined with cherry trees, its great wooden palaces, the fragrance of incense drifting through corridors where courtiers whispered poetry and intrigue. It was a city of grace, of order, of art. It was also a city of decay. For centuries, the courtiers had ruled Japan through words and ceremony. They had written verses about love and the moon, and they had perfected the art of indifference. To them, the wars of the countryside were distant storms, regrettable but far away. Yet, even as they recited poems beneath lantern light, the world was changing. Beyond the capital's gates, in the provinces, a new kind of power was forming. The power of the warrior, the bushi. They were men of the sword, men who valued loyalty above birthright and courage above refinement. They came from rough lands, lived hard lives, and fought for those who rewarded them with honor and land. At first, the court used them, hired them to guard estates, collect taxes, suppress rebellions. But steel has a way of reshaping the hand that wields it. The warriors grew rich, then independent. They began to see themselves not as servants, but as the true protectors of the realm. By the time Yorimasa was born, that transformation was nearly complete. He had grown up in a world balanced between the brush and the blade. His father taught him poetry, his tutors trained him in archery, he served the emperor, wrote verses admired at court, and earned respect for his calm intellect. He was not a man of rage or ambition. He believed in harmony, in loyalty, and in the quiet strength of discipline. But he also knew how fragile that harmony was. When he was young, he saw his clan, the Minamoto, crushed by the Taira in a series of bloody conflicts. Their leaders were executed, their lands were taken. Yorimasa survived, but he never forgot the humiliation. Even as he grew into an elder statesman, serving emperors and nobles, that memory remained, like a scar that never healed. And then came Taira no Kiyomori. Kiyomori had risen from humble beginnings to become the most powerful man in Japan. He commanded armies, controlled trade, and manipulated the court with ruthless precision. He had wealth beyond measure, but what he desired most was legitimacy. Through marriages and alliances, he bound the imperial family to his own. Under Kiyomori's rule, even the emperor's word had become a formality. To Yorimasa, it was a betrayal of the old order, of the delicate balance between power and virtue that had once defined Japan. And so, when Prince Mochihito's call reached him, Yorimasa recognized it not as a chance for glory, but as a final duty. Now, standing before the Uji River, that duty had come to claim him. He looked again toward the far bank. The mist was thinning. Red banners emerged, followed by the glint of sunlight on armor. The Taira army had arrived. He turned to his men. "Cut the bridge," he said simply. Axes rose and fell. Planks crashed into the water below. The bridge that had once joined the two banks was reduced to a skeletal frame. Narrow beams slick with dew, barely wide enough for a single man to cross. It was a desperate tactic, but an effective one. The Taira would have to advance one by one, easy targets for archers. For a moment, the world was silent again. Then came the drums. Deep, thunderous, rolling like the heartbeat of war. The Taira vanguard moved forward. Arrows hissed across the water, vanishing into the mist. Horses reared, men shouted. The first of the Taira tried to cross, their feet slipping on the narrow beams. Some made it halfway before falling into the rushing current. Others pressed on, leaping from beam to beam. Yorimasa raised his bow and fired. The arrow flew straight, striking its mark with deadly precision. He drew another and another. Each found a target. His movements were measured, his breathing calm, his mind still. To his men, it seemed as though their commander stood outside of time, untouched by the chaos around him. The monks of Midera fought fiercely beside him, their robes fluttering as they swung their naginata. They chanted even as they struck, invoking the Buddha to witness their courage. But the Taira were too many. Their archers filled the sky with arrows. Their cavalry began to cross at shallower points downstream. The tide of battle shifted slowly, inexorably. Still, Yorimasa did not falter. When one of his retainers cried out that the enemy was crossing, he nodded once. "Then we meet them here." He had seen countless battles, but never one like this. One in which every heartbeat felt like a farewell. As he drew another arrow, his mind wandered, not to fear, but to reflection. He thought of the poems he had written in his youth, of the moon over the capital, of the scent of plum blossoms in spring. He thought of the life he had lived, loyal, steadfast, imperfect, but his own. And he wondered if, perhaps, the true test of a man was not in how he lived, but in how he met his end. The river roared, the battle raged, and Minamoto no Yorimasa, the old poet-warrior, stood at its heart, calm, resolute, unbroken. The sound of the Uji River filled the air, the crash of water against wood, the creak of the broken bridge, the roar of men locked in combat. Arrows whistled, horses screamed, and the voices of the dying rose like smoke into the sky. The Taira army pressed forward, relentless. They came in waves, disciplined, armored, unyielding. Even with the bridge in ruins, they found ways to cross. Some lashed together makeshift rafts. Others plunged directly into the river, swimming their horses through the current. Yorimasa's men held their ground. They fought not for victory, but for something more enduring. For loyalty, for dignity, for memory. Each man who stood beside him knew this was a battle that would be remembered not for its outcome, but for its meaning. On the temple grounds, the monks of Midera and Mount Hiei formed a final defensive line. They fought with both prayer and fury, their chants merging with the clang of blades. To them, death was not defeat, it was a path to rebirth, to the pure land. Their faces were calm, even as their robes were soaked in blood. Yorimasa moved among them like a steady current, his voice calm, his instructions precise. To his soldiers, it was as though he saw the battle not as chaos, but as something composed. A final poem unfolding line by line. Then, through the smoke and noise, a challenge rang out. A young warrior from the Taira side rode his horse to the river's edge. His armor gleamed red in the sunlight, his voice carried clear and bold over the water. His name was Ashikaga Tadatsuna, a man famed for his courage and his skill. He called out, "Minamoto no Yorimasa, I have heard of your strength and your bow. Show me the power that has become legend." The noise of battle fell for an instant. Yorimasa looked across the river. The young warrior stood proud, sword raised, daring him to respond. Without a word, the old general reached for an arrow. He drew the bowstring back slowly, deliberately, his body steady despite the weight of age. The air seemed to still around him. He exhaled and released. The arrow cut across the river like a streak of light. It struck Tadatsuna's horse square in the chest. The animal reared and collapsed, throwing its rider violently to the ground. Gasps rippled across the battlefield. Even the Taira soldiers, hardened by war, could not help but admire the precision. At 74 years old, Minamoto no Yorimasa's aim was as true as ever. For a moment his men cheered. The monks raised their voices in praise. The Taira hesitated, stunned by the shot, but it was only a heartbeat of reprieve. The Taira regrouped and surged forward again. Their numbers were too great, their resolve too strong. Step by step, the Minamoto line was forced back toward the temple. The battle became chaos. Arrows flew in every direction. Horses and men crashed through the shallow waters. Smoke from burning arrows drifted through the trees. The Phoenix Hall of Byodo Inn, the temple that symbolized paradise, was now surrounded by fire and death. Inside, Yorimasa's retainers pleaded with him to flee. "My lord," one cried, "we can still escape into the hills. There is time." Yorimasa shook his head. "I have seen too many winters," he said softly. "It is not for me to run from fate." He looked out at the battlefield, at the monks still fighting, at the banners of the Minamoto falling one by one. The sound of swords and screams seemed distant now, like the echo of a memory. He turned to his attendants. "Bring me ink and brush," he said. They obeyed, though their hands trembled. Yorimasa sat upon the steps of the Phoenix Hall. The wooden floor beneath him vibrated faintly with the rhythm of battle. He unrolled a small strip of paper and began to write. His hand was steady, his characters were elegant. He wrote the words that would become his final poem. A jisei! A death verse. Like a buried tree, I had no chance to bloom, yet this is my fate, how sad my end shall be. When he finished, he placed the poem beside him and bowed his head for a moment in silence. Then he called for his retainer, Watanabe Tsuna. "Tsuna," he said, "this sword has been in my family for generations. Take it, guard it, return it to my kin when this is over." Tsuna hesitated. His voice broke as he answered, "My lord, to leave you here, I cannot." Yorimasa's expression softened. "Then you will not leave," he said quietly, "but you will not die before I do." He drew his dagger, a short, curved blade, polished to a silver sheen. He looked down at it for a moment, not with fear, but with understanding. To die by one's own hand was not yet a custom in Japan. But Yorimasa believed that to be captured would be a stain on his honor, and a shame to his clan. Better, he thought, to choose his own end, to die as a warrior, by his own will. He looked toward the river one final time. The mist had lifted completely. The water gleamed gold in the morning sun. He whispered a final prayer to Amida Buddha, then pressed the dagger into his abdomen. His movement was precise, controlled, dignified. Watanabe Tsuna knelt beside him, tears streaming down his face. As Yorimasa fell forward, Tsuna drew his own blade and cut his lord's throat cleanly. A final act of loyalty, ending his suffering. The old general's body slumped onto the temple steps. His blood flowed into the earth, dark and still. The battle raged on around him, but for him, the world had already gone silent. The first act of seppuku in samurai history had been committed. Within moments, Tsuna took his own life as well, falling beside his master. When the Taira soldiers finally broke through the Minamoto lines, they found the Phoenix Hall in ruins. and the bodies of Yorimasa and his men lying where they had made their stand. Some among the Taira knelt and bowed in respect. Even in victory, they could not deny what they had witnessed: the dignity of a man who chose death over dishonor. The surviving Minamoto fled north, carrying with them Yorimasa's sword and his poem. They would tell his story, not as a defeat, but as a beginning. In the weeks that followed, word of Yorimasa's death spread through the capital. The courtiers who had once dismissed him as a relic of an older time now spoke his name in reverence. His poem was copied and read aloud in gatherings of nobles and monks. His act of self-sacrifice struck a chord that neither the sword nor the brush could silence. Heian, once the city of peace, was changing. The courtiers who had spent their lives reciting verses now whispered of rebellion and vengeance. The Taira, though victorious, had sown the seeds of their own downfall, and somewhere in the distant provinces, two brothers, Minamoto no Yoritomo and Minamoto no Yoshitsune, heard the news. They would take up the banner that Yorimasa had raised, and the war he had begun would engulf the nation. Years later, chroniclers would write that on the banks of the Uji River, something greater than a battle had taken place. They would say that Yorimasa's death marked the end of one age and the birth of another. The age of the courtiers had ended, and the age of the samurai had begun. But for those who had stood beside him that day, it was not history. It was memory. They would remember the mist over the river, the echo of the drums, the calm voice of their commander as he told them to hold the bridge. They would remember the sound of his bow, the flight of that single arrow, and the stillness that followed. And they would remember the moment when their lord, faced with defeat, chose to die with grace rather than live with shame. The story of Yorimasa's death spread across Japan, carried by word of mouth and written in the great war tales of the age. In the Heike Monogatari, the epic chronicle of the Genpei War, his final act is told with reverence, a moment of stillness and sorrow before the storm of history. In the years to come, countless warriors would face their own end with the same quiet resolve. They would compose their own death poems, bow to their comrades, and fall by their own hands. The ritual that began with Yorimasa would become part of the samurai's code, the ultimate expression of loyalty and honor. But for him, it had not been ritual. It had been truth. The Phoenix Hall was repaired after the battle, its walls rebuilt, its reflection once more perfect on the water. Yet beneath its floors lay the memory of that day, the place where the old man of the Minamoto had met his destiny. Even now, when the river runs low, locals say that the stones at the river's edge bear faint marks, as if written by the blood of that battle long ago. When travelers come to Uji and walk the grounds of Byodo Inn, they see peace and beauty. They hear birds, not swords. The scent of incense replaces the smell of smoke. But if one listens carefully, perhaps in the early morning when mist still clings to the water, one might hear something else: the echo of a bowstring, the chant of a dying monk, the whisper of a final poem carried on the wind. For in that place, on that morning in 1180, a man chose to meet his end not with despair, but with clarity. And in doing so, he became something eternal. The bridge between eras, the embodiment of the warrior's heart. The river ran red for hours after the battle. Smoke drifted low over Uji, curling between the broken planks of the bridge and the shattered bodies of men who had fought to the very end. The Taira banners fluttered weakly in the wind, their red silk darkened by ash. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by the low murmur of the river and the distant cries of crows. Amid the wreckage, a single poem was found, written in a graceful hand. It was Yorimasa's final verse, and in the capital, it would soon be recited like prayer. Like a buried tree, I had no chance to bloom, yet this is my fate, how sad my end shall be. Even the victors were said to have paused when they heard it. For in those lines, the old warrior had captured the passing of an age. When the Taira soldiers left Uji, they took little notice of the burned bridge or the ruined temple. But those who lived nearby remembered. They spoke of how the old general had died seated in quiet dignity, his white beard stained with blood, his face serene. They said that when he fell, even the river seemed to stop its flow for a moment. Back in Heian, word of the battle spread swiftly. The court, once a place of elegant indifference, trembled. The Taira had won the day, but their dominance had begun to crumble. For though they ruled with power, they had lost something far greater, the reverence of the people. Yorimasa's death became a symbol. His defiance against impossible odds inspired not only the Minamoto, but also those who had grown weary of the Taira's arrogance. His act of self-determined death, still unfamiliar at the time, was seen as the ultimate expression of loyalty, purity, and pride. In the temples and noble houses of Kyoto, poets wrote verses in his honor. Monks chanted sutras for his soul. Even among the Taira, some whispered his name with respect. The man who had once been dismissed as an old relic of the past had, in death, become the face of Japan's future. But for the living, the story was far from over. The rebellion Yorimasa had begun, though crushed at Uji, had lit a flame that could not be extinguished. Across the provinces, discontent simmered. The Taira had enemies everywhere, in temples, among noble families, and most dangerously, among the surviving branches of the Minamoto clan. One of them, a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo, had been living in exile in the eastern province of Izu. When he heard of Yorimasa's death, he understood what it meant. It was not merely the fall of one man, it was a summons. He took up arms. What followed was a war that would reshape Japan forever. The Genpei War, a conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto, would rage for 5 years, from 1180 to 1185. It was a war of shifting loyalties, of family against family, of poetry turned to prophecy. The chronicles would later record countless battles, Fujikawa, Ichinotani, Yashima, and the final clash at Dan-no-ura, where the tides themselves seemed to favor destiny. But all of it, the blood, the glory, the tragedy, began with the death of one old man at the Uji River. Yoritomo proved a different kind of leader. He was cautious where others were reckless, pragmatic where others sought fame. He knew that Yorimasa's sacrifice had given his clan a story, a purpose, and he used it well. Under his command, the Minamoto forces gathered strength. In the east, new armies were formed. Samurai who had once served the Taira began to defect, drawn not only by ambition, but by the vision of a new order, one where warriors, not courtiers, would govern Japan. The Taira fought fiercely, but their power was built on fear and privilege. Each defeat weakened their hold, and in 1181, when Taira no Kiyomori, the man who had ruled Japan like an emperor, died of fever, the heart of their power began to rot. As the war spread, the courtiers of Heian watched from their palaces, helpless. The elegance of their world, the painted screens, the poetry contests, the perfumed letters, faded before the sound of marching feet. Japan was changing. The Heian period, which had lasted nearly 4 centuries, was ending, and in its place, a new age of warriors was being born. For the Minamoto, it was destiny fulfilled. For Yorimasa, it was vindication. Though he had not lived to see it, his death at Uji became the moral foundation upon which the new warrior order was built. His story was told in every camp, his poem recited beside every fire. Samurai spoke his name when they swore their oaths, remembering how he had faced death without fear or regret. It was said that when Yoritomo established his headquarters at Kamakura, he kept a copy of Yorimasa's poem in his chamber, a reminder that honor, not victory, was the true measure of a warrior. The war reached its climax at Dan-no-ura, a great naval battle fought in the narrow straits of the inland sea. There, the Taira met their end. Their fleet was destroyed, their banners sank beneath the waves. The young emperor, a child of the Taira line, drowned with his grandmother, clutching the imperial regalia in his small hands. The sea turned red, and with it ended the rule of the Taira. When the news reached Kamakura, Yoritomo was said to have bowed his head and offered a prayer for Yorimasa's soul. The path the old man had opened through his death had led the Minamoto to ultimate victory. With the Taira destroyed, Yoritomo established a new form of government, the bakufu, or shogunate. He ruled from Kamakura, far from the ceremonial splendor of Kyoto. The emperor remained, but only as a symbol. Real power now lay with the warriors. This was the birth of the samurai era, an age that would define Japan for centuries to come. Yet even as new castles rose and new battles were fought, Yorimasa's story endured. It was retold in the Heike Monogatari, the great epic of the Genpei War. His death became one of its most moving chapters, the quiet prelude to the thunder of history. Artists painted his final moments, the old general seated at the temple steps, his bow beside him, his face calm as he prepared to meet death. Poets wrote verses in his honor, and monks recited sutras for his spirit. In time, the ritual of seppuku that he had performed in solitude became part of samurai tradition. To die by one's own hand, with dignity and composure, came to be seen as the ultimate act of loyalty. The warrior's life, like the cherry blossom, was brief but beautiful, and in its fall, there was honor. Centuries passed, and Japan changed again and again. The shoguns rose and fell. New wars came, and new heroes were born. But in every era, Yorimasa's story remained. The tale of a man who chose principle over life, and whose death gave meaning to generations that followed. Today, if you travel to Uji, you can still visit the Byodo-in temple. The Phoenix Hall stands exactly where it did in Yorimasa's time. Its reflection on the water is so perfect that it seems to hover between worlds, the real and the remembered. The air there is different, still, patient, touched by history. In spring, when the cherry blossoms fall, their petals drift onto the river just as they did centuries ago. The water carries them downstream, over the place where the old bridge once stood, past the stones that still bear faint scars from the battle. Visitors walk quietly along the riverbank, unaware that beneath their feet lies the soil that once drank the blood of poets and warriors. The sound of the river has not changed. It whispers softly, as if telling the story again and again to anyone who will listen. Some say that on certain mornings, when the mist is thick and the temple bells begin to ring, the spirit of the old general still lingers there, not as a ghost, but as a presence, watching the sunrise as he once did. In the stillness, you might almost hear his voice, calm, dignified, resolute, reminding the world that honor is not bound to victory, nor courage to youth. For Minamoto no Yorimasa, death was not defeat. It was completion. He had lived in an age of beauty and illusion, served with grace, and died with conviction. He became the bridge between the world of courtiers and the world of warriors, between the elegance of the past and the discipline of the future. And like the Phoenix Hall that still rises above the Uji River, his story endures, reborn again and again. Each time someone remembers that courage, in its purest form, is quiet. The river flows on, untroubled, carrying its reflections toward the sea. The cherry blossoms fall, their petals carried by the wind. The temple bells echo across the valley, fading into the distance. But somewhere, in the rhythm of that river and the silence between those bells, the spirit of Yorimasa remains. Calm, steadfast, eternal. The duel that shook a clan did more than end a rebellion. It transformed a nation. It marked the moment when Japan ceased to be ruled by poets and began to be ruled by warriors. And in that moment, an old man's death became the birth of a new world.